Something extraordinary is unfolding in Washington right now, and most Americans have not yet grasped how serious it truly is. An emergency session of Congress has been convened under mounting pressure, fueled by growing reports that former President Donald Trump may have crossed a constitutional line so severe that it now threatens not only his political future, but the stability of the entire system. This is no longer a routine partisan dispute, and it is not another headline designed to inflame social media. What is happening strikes at the core of how American democracy functions and why the global economy has trusted it for generations. Behind closed doors, lawmakers are confronting a crisis that escalated quietly but rapidly. Just weeks ago, Donald Trump authorized the redirection of approximately $47 billion in federal funds that had already been allocated by Congress for specific purposes. Those funds, approved through lawful appropriations, were instead funneled toward border wall construction and expanded deportation initiatives without congressional consent. This was not a disagreement over policy priorities. It was an assertion of unilateral control over public money, a power the Constitution explicitly denies to the presidency. The Constitution leaves no ambiguity on this matter. Control over federal spending resides solely with Congress. Article 1, Section 9 states plainly that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury except by appropriations made by law. That provision exists for a reason. It is one of the most fundamental safeguards against executive overreach. When that boundary is ignored, the consequences extend far beyond politics. They reach into governance itself. Congress responded by blocking the transfer. The response from Trump was not compromise, but escalation. Government operations slowed, then froze. Essential services began shutting down. Passport offices stopped processing applications. Social Security offices halted new claims. Federal employees went unpaid. What began as a funding dispute turned into a paralysis of the state, one that millions of ordinary Americans felt almost immediately. The pivotal moment arrived on October 26th, when federal Judge Sarah Morrison issued an emergency ruling that sent shockwaves through Washington. Her language was direct and unusually forceful. She described Trump's actions as a flagrant violation of the Constitution and legally indefensible. This was not a procedural slap on the wrist. It was a judicial rebuke of historic magnitude, the kind rarely directed at a president outside of moments like Watergate. Trump's reaction only intensified the crisis. Rather than comply or seek legal remedy, he publicly dismissed the ruling and asserted that judges do not have the authority to limit his actions. He claimed the power to reallocate federal funds regardless of congressional intent or judicial oversight. In effect, he placed himself above both branches designed to restrain executive authority. At that point, this ceased to be a theoretical debate. It became a constitutional standoff with immediate real-world consequences. Markets began reacting not to economic data, but to institutional risk. Investors, policymakers, and legal scholars all recognized the same danger. When the rule of law itself appears negotiable, stability evaporates. This is the moment where political conflict becomes systemic threat, and why the situation unfolding now is being watched with growing alarm, not just in Washington, but around the world. To understand why this crisis has rattled Washington so deeply, you have to look beyond the surface of budget disputes and partisan outrage. What is happening right now is not just a clash between Donald Trump and Congress. It is a stress test of the American system itself, one that exposes how fragile stability becomes when institutional norms are pushed to their limits. For decades, the separation of powers has functioned not because every actor behaved perfectly, but because most respected the boundaries even when they were inconvenient. That unwritten restraint is now under direct assault. Financial markets understand this better than most political commentators. The value of the American economy has never rested solely on productivity or innovation. It rests on predictability. Investors around the world place their money in the United States because they trust that contracts will be enforced, laws will be followed, and no single individual can rewrite the rules overnight. This trust is what economists quietly refer to as the rule of law premium. Remove it, and the entire system becomes just another high-risk environment. That is why the reaction from Wall Street was immediate and unusually sharp. Analysts were not reacting to inflation numbers or interest rate signals. They were reacting to institutional instability. When a president openly challenges the authority of Congress to control spending and dismisses a federal court ruling as irrelevant, the message to global capital is unmistakable. The rules are no longer guaranteed, and when rules become optional, capital becomes mobile. At the same time, the political consequences inside Washington began to accelerate. Congress members found themselves caught between constitutional duty and political survival. This was not merely a dispute between branches of government. It ignited a deep internal fracture within the Republican Party itself. Moderate lawmakers who attempted to explore compromise solutions were publicly attacked, not by opposition figures, but by their own party's leader. Loyalty was redefined as absolute obedience. Here is the moment where everything shifts, and it is the point most people miss. This crisis is no longer about whether Trump can divert money. It is about whether any future president will feel bound by congressional authority at all. If this precedent stands, the office of the presidency changes permanently. Every future occupant, regardless of party, inherits a vastly expanded power to bypass the legislature whenever resistance arises. That is not a political outcome, it is a structural transformation. Inside Republican circles, fear replaced strategy. Senators understood the pattern because they had seen it before. Officials who once enjoyed full support were discarded the moment they prioritized law over loyalty. Careers ended not because of corruption or incompetence, but because they refused to cross legal lines. The lesson was clear: deviate once, and you are expendable. This atmosphere paralyzed effective governance. Lawmakers focused less on solving the shutdown and more on avoiding political retaliation. The longer the standoff dragged on, the more visible the damage became. Public services remained frozen. Approval ratings slipped. Polling began to show that the broader electorate was losing patience, and crucially, that blame was shifting. Meanwhile, the judiciary moved with uncharacteristic speed. The urgency of the situation forced legal processes that usually take months or years into days. Judge Morrison's ruling did more than block the transfer of funds. It placed the executive branch under direct constitutional scrutiny. Her words carried weight because they were precise and unambiguous. This was not a gray area. It was, in her assessment, a clear violation. As legal scholars from across the ideological spectrum began to agree on that point, the political narrative changed. This was no longer a partisan accusation. It was a constitutional indictment. The language used by conservative legal voices confirmed what many had quietly feared. If the judiciary had remained silent, it would have signaled that executive power no longer had meaningful limits. The implications of that silence would have been far more dangerous than confrontation, because once a system demonstrates that it will not enforce its own rules, it invites future abuses that go far beyond the present conflict. This is why the current moment feels different. It is not loud chaos. It is quiet erosion. And history shows that democracies do not collapse all at once. They weaken gradually, one exception at a time, until the exception becomes the rule. What happens next will determine whether this crisis remains a warning or becomes a turning point. And that outcome depends not on rhetoric, but on whether institutions are willing to defend the boundaries that define them, even when doing so carries political cost. As the political machinery in Washington ground to a halt, the consequences began spreading far beyond the Capitol. This is the point where theory collided with reality. Government shutdowns are often discussed as abstract inconveniences, but this one exposed how deeply intertwined daily life is with institutional stability. Passport offices closed. Social Security applications stopped processing. Federal workers missed paychecks. These were not symbolic disruptions. They were tangible failures that affected millions of ordinary Americans who had no stake in the power struggle unfolding above them. Public patience is resilient, but it is not infinite. Initially, partisan loyalty insulated much of the backlash. Core supporters viewed the standoff as necessary resistance, but as days turned into weeks, frustration replaced ideology. The question shifted from who was right to why the government was no longer functioning. Polling reflected this change with brutal clarity. A growing majority began to see the crisis not as principled defiance, but as manufactured chaos. This shift is where political damage becomes structural. Voters do not reward instability, even when they agree with underlying goals. Markets behave the same way. Volatility triggers defensive behavior. Capital pulls back. Risk premiums rise. The economic consequences do not announce themselves all at once. They surface gradually through higher borrowing costs, delayed investments, and eroded confidence. These signals were already appearing beneath the noise. At the center of this storm stood members of Congress facing an impossible calculus. Supporting the president meant endorsing actions that many privately believed crossed constitutional lines. Opposing him meant risking political annihilation. The incentive structure was broken. Governance became secondary to survival. And when elected officials are trapped in that position, the system ceases to function as designed. Here is the critical turning point that changes how this entire crisis should be understood. This is no longer a confrontation between branches of government. It is a confrontation between rules and power. Once that line is crossed, every institution becomes vulnerable. Courts can issue rulings, but enforcement depends on legitimacy. Congress can assert authority, but compliance depends on respect. When those norms fracture, the architecture holds only until it is tested again. History offers a sobering lesson. Democracies rarely collapse through coups or dramatic seizures of power. They erode through normalization. Each boundary violation becomes precedent for the next. Each exception weakens the rule. Eventually, what once would have sparked national outrage becomes background noise. That is the danger embedded in this moment. Not what happens this month, but what becomes acceptable next year. Inside legal circles, the alarm was unmistakable. Scholars warned that if the executive branch could ignore appropriations law without consequence, the foundational balance of power would be permanently altered. The power of the purse was deliberately placed in congressional hands to prevent exactly this scenario. It was designed as a brake on unilateral action. Removing that brake does not speed up governance. It destabilizes it. Meanwhile, international observers were watching closely. The global economy does not operate on slogans or campaign rhetoric. It responds to signals of reliability. For decades, the United States projected an image of institutional durability. Disputes were resolved through courts, power transferred peacefully, laws constrained leaders. When that image cracks, even slightly, the ripple effects extend far beyond domestic politics. Foreign investors began recalibrating risk, not because America was suddenly weak, but because predictability was no longer guaranteed. In financial terms, uncertainty is more dangerous than bad news. Markets can price in losses. They cannot price chaos. The longer the crisis persisted, the more costly that uncertainty became. Within Washington, whispers turned into open concern. Lawmakers who once believed the system would self-correct realized that assumption might be wrong. Self-correction depends on actors choosing restraint. When restraint disappears, the mechanisms designed to protect democracy strain under pressure. This is why the judicial response mattered so deeply. The court did not merely rule on a budget issue. It reaffirmed a principle that no individual stands above the law. That message was not directed at one president. It was directed at the office itself. And whether that message holds will shape the trajectory of American governance for years to come. The crisis now stands at a crossroads. Either institutional boundaries are reinforced restoring confidence slowly and painfully, or the erosion continues, setting precedents that future leaders will exploit. The outcome will not be decided by speeches or social media posts. It will be decided by whether the system proves capable of defending its own foundations when doing so is politically inconvenient. What follows will determine whether this moment is remembered as a warning that strengthened democracy or as the point where erosion became irreversible. As pressure mounted across institutions, attention began shifting toward one arena that had so far remained largely silent but now carried enormous weight: the Supreme Court. For years, the court has attempted to position itself above partisan turbulence, presenting itself as a neutral arbiter rather than a political actor. Chief Justice John Roberts, in particular, has emphasized the importance of institutional credibility, aware that public trust in the judiciary is fragile and easily damaged. This crisis, however, threatens to drag the court directly into the center of a constitutional firestorm with no neutral exit. If the dispute over executive spending authority reaches the Supreme Court, the implications would extend far beyond the immediate case. A ruling against Trump would reinforce congressional power but risk inflaming accusations of judicial activism from his supporters. A ruling in his favor would fundamentally alter the balance of power, effectively granting future presidents a dangerous precedent to bypass legislative control over public funds. Either outcome carries consequences that the court has spent decades trying to avoid. What makes this moment uniquely volatile is that the judiciary is no longer dealing with hypothetical overreach. The actions in question already occurred. Billions were diverted, agencies were shut down, citizens were impacted. The court would not be speculating about potential harm. It would be ruling on damage already done. That reality compresses timelines and amplifies stakes. This is where the crisis reaches its most dangerous inflection point, because once the highest court is forced to intervene, the question is no longer whether norms have been broken, but whether they can still be enforced. Courts derive their authority not from force, but from compliance. They issue rulings with the assumption that those rulings will be respected. When a political leader openly challenges that assumption, the judiciary faces a test it was never designed to pass through coercion. Here is the moment that should give every American pause. If a president can ignore Congress, dismiss court rulings, and suffer no meaningful consequence, then the Constitution becomes a suggestion rather than a constraint. And when constitutional limits become optional, power no longer checks itself. It consolidates, quietly at first, then openly. Legal scholars across ideological lines recognize this danger immediately. Conservative constitutional experts, many of whom have defended executive authority in the past, began warning that this was not a gray area. They argued that the violation was unusually clear, which explained the unusually harsh language used by the federal judge. This was not a dispute over interpretation, it was a breach of structure. At the same time, the political consequences were compounding. Republican leadership found itself trapped between loyalty to Trump and loyalty to the institution they serve. History offered them no safe precedent. Previous presidents tested boundaries, but rarely so directly, and almost never with open defiance of judicial authority. This left party leaders navigating an environment where every choice carried existential risk. Public opinion continued to harden. Independent voters, suburban districts, and moderate conservatives began expressing fatigue with perpetual crisis. These are the constituencies that often decide elections, and they are historically intolerant of instability. For them, this was no longer about border policy or budget priorities. It was about whether government could function at all. Democratic strategists recognized the opening immediately. The narrative began shifting from partisan conflict to constitutional defense. Instead of arguing policy outcomes, they framed the issue as a binary choice between law and chaos. And unlike previous political messaging battles, this time they had something tangible to point to: a court ruling labeling presidential actions unconstitutional. This reframing matters because American elections are rarely decided by extremes. They are decided in the middle, where voters value predictability over spectacle. The longer the crisis persisted, the more it reinforced a perception of dysfunction that cut across party lines. Meanwhile, international confidence continued to erode quietly. Allies questioned reliability. Investors recalculated exposure. None of this made headlines, but it showed up in subtle market behavior, delayed commitments, and cautious forecasts. Institutional trust, once weakened, does not rebound quickly. The judiciary now stands as the last remaining stabilizing force capable of restoring equilibrium, but only if its authority is respected. If ignored, the damage would not be confined to one presidency. It would redefine the limits of executive power permanently. What makes this phase of the crisis so consequential is that there is no dramatic resolution on the horizon. No single vote, ruling, or statement will instantly restore balance. Instead, the outcome will emerge through a series of decisions that collectively determine whether the American system still possesses the ability to restrain itself. This is no longer about Donald Trump as an individual. It is about whether the constitutional framework that has governed the United States for more than 2 centuries can withstand sustained pressure from within. The answer to that question is being written now, not in history books, but in courtrooms, legislative chambers, and the choices made by those entrusted with power. And as the system strains, one truth becomes increasingly clear. Democracies do not fail when they are attacked from the outside. They fail when the mechanisms designed to protect them are tested, ignored, and eventually normalized into irrelevance. The next phase of this crisis will reveal whether that line still holds. As this crisis moves toward its uncertain resolution, it is worth stepping back and asking a quieter, more enduring question. What does this moment ultimately reveal about the United States, not as a political battlefield, but as a system built to endure stress? The answer does not lie solely in court rulings, congressional votes, or election outcomes. It lies in whether the structures that have guided the nation for generations still command enough respect to function when tested. For more than 2 centuries, the American system has relied on an unspoken agreement as much as on written law. That agreement holds that no individual, no matter how powerful, stands above the framework that governs everyone else. It assumes that those entrusted with authority will accept limits, even when those limits are inconvenient. That assumption has been challenged before, but rarely with such persistence and visibility. What makes this moment different is not the presence of conflict. Conflict is built into democracy. What makes it different is the willingness to dismiss restraint as weakness and to frame accountability as betrayal. When those ideas gain traction, the damage extends beyond any single administration. It alters expectations. It reshapes norms. And once norms erode, rebuilding them is far more difficult than breaking them. This is why the stakes extend far beyond Donald Trump or any single election cycle. The precedent set now will inform how future leaders behave, regardless of party. If executive power expands through defiance rather than consent, future presidents will inherit that expansion. Power rarely contracts on its own. It accumulates unless deliberately constrained. Yet there is also another truth worth acknowledging. The system has not collapsed. Courts have spoken, legislators have resisted, journalists have investigated, citizens have questioned. These responses matter. They are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a system under strain but still functioning. Democracy does not look calm when it is healthy. It looks contested. The outcome of this crisis will not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It will emerge gradually, through compliance or defiance, through accountability or avoidance, through whether institutions are strengthened or hollowed out by what they endure. History will not judge this period by rhetoric alone, but by whether boundaries were restored or quietly erased. For the American public, the responsibility does not end with observation. Systems endure because people expect them to. They survive because citizens demand standards, not personalities. The Constitution does not enforce itself. It depends on belief, vigilance, and a shared understanding that rules matter even when they obstruct what we want in the moment. This moment is uncomfortable because it exposes how fragile stability can be when tested from within. But it is also clarifying. It reminds us why constraints exist, why process matters, and why power unchecked is always a liability, never an asset. In the end, this story is not about one ruling, one president, or one Congress. It is about whether the United States continues to operate as a nation governed by laws or slowly drifts toward governance by force of will. That distinction has defined the country's prosperity, its credibility, and its influence for generations. The question now is simple, but the answer will define an era. When the system is tested, does it bend and recover, or does it yield and change forever? The answer is still being written, and what happens next will tell us not just who holds power, but whether power itself remains accountable.